The night the monitors began screaming, the hospital felt less like a place of healing and more like a battlefield finally losing its strongest commander. A 4-star female general, a woman whose presence alone once silenced war rooms and steadied nations, lay motionless under harsh white lights while 22 of the country's best doctors stood helpless. Their gloved hands hovered, their eyes searched screens and scans, and yet the truth pressed down on all of them at once: everything they knew was failing her. Outside the intensive care unit, rain hammered the windows like a countdown, and somewhere deep within that chaos, a single detail, small, quiet, almost invisible, waited to be seen by the one person no one thought mattered. If you believe stories like this, stories about kindness, second chances, and hope coming from the most unexpected places, then take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs faith restored, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to channel name. Your support keeps stories like this alive. The general's life had been built on discipline, sacrifice, and impossible decisions. She had risen through ranks where women were once told they did not belong, carrying the weight of responsibility without complaint. Her body, however, now betrayed her. A sudden collapse during a ceremonial briefing had brought her here, unconscious, her breathing shallow, her heart rhythm erratic. Specialists were flown in. Panels were convened. Words like rare, unprecedented, and unresponsive filled the room. Tests ruled out the obvious, then the less obvious, and finally the nearly impossible. Every answer led to another dead end. The doctors were not careless or cruel, they were exhausted, frightened, and deeply aware that the world expected them to perform a miracle. In the corridors outside the ICU, life continued in quieter, unnoticed ways. Floors still needed cleaning. Trash bins still filled. Coffee spilled and dried and spilled again. Among those moving silently through the night was a single dad janitor, a man whose life had taught him to observe more than speak. He worked the graveyard shift because it paid a little extra, enough to cover school supplies and shoes for his young child waiting at home with a neighbor. His hands were rough from years of work, his back permanently tired, but his eyes were sharp in a way only hardship can sharpen them. Hospitals, to him, were not places of prestige, they were places of patterns. He noticed routines, changes, smells, sounds, and the way things felt when they were wrong. He had cleaned this floor hundreds of times before, but that night felt different. There was tension in the air, a heaviness that made even the machines seem louder. As he moved carefully near the ICU doors, he noticed a faint, unusual odor, sharp, metallic, mixed with something sweet. It reminded him of a memory he did not often share, the night his wife had fallen ill years ago, long before she passed, when no one could explain why her condition worsened so quickly. Back then, he had watched helplessly as doctors searched for answers that came too late. That memory had burned itself into him, not as knowledge, but as instinct. The janitor paused longer than usual, pretending to adjust his cart while his eyes traced the lines running into the general's room. He noticed condensation where it shouldn't have been, a subtle discoloration near one of the ports, something so minor that professionals focused on larger crises might overlook it. To him, it felt loud. It felt wrong. But he was a janitor, a nobody in scrubs meant to blend into the walls. He had been taught his entire life not to question authority, especially not people in white coats with titles and medals of their own. Minutes passed. The machines inside continued their frantic rhythm. A nurse rushed out, face pale, whispering words that sounded like surrender. Something in the janitor broke open then, not bravado, not confidence, but a quiet desperation born of loss. He knew what it felt like to stay silent and regret it forever. So he spoke up, his voice unsure but steady enough to be heard, pointing out what he had seen, what he had smelled, what felt familiar in the worst way. At first, his words landed like dust in a storm. Confusion, irritation, and disbelief crossed tired faces. This was not how hospitals worked. This was not who made suggestions. But desperation has a way of lowering walls. One doctor, then another, paused long enough to look, not at him, but where he indicated. Tests were rechecked. Equipment was examined more closely. A specialist frowned, then froze. What had been missed was not dramatic or cinematic, it was subtle, technical, and deadly. A rare reaction triggered by a combination of materials and medications, creating a slow, invisible poisoning that mimicked multiple other conditions. It was something most doctors would see once, if ever, in a lifetime. The room erupted into motion again, but this time with purpose. Protocols changed. Treatments shifted. The machine's screams softened into steadier rhythms. Hours passed like years. The janitor returned to his work, heart pounding, convinced he had overstepped and would be reprimanded, maybe even fired. He expected security, paperwork, consequences. Instead, near dawn, a doctor approached him with eyes full of something close to awe and exhaustion. The general's condition had stabilized. Not cured, not saved yet, but pulled back from the edge. The impossible had cracked open. As the sun rose, light spilled into the ICU, touching the general's face as if reminding her where she was. Slowly, painfully, she began to respond. Days later, when she finally regained consciousness, the story reached her in fragments. 22 doctors. Endless tests. No answers. Then a janitor. A single father. A man who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking up. She asked to meet him, not as a superior or symbol, but as a human being whose courage had matched hers in a different uniform. Their meeting was quiet and brief, heavy with unspoken understanding. Two lives shaped by service, one visible to the world, the other invisible by design. The general recovered slowly, carrying the knowledge that rank and intelligence mean little without humility. The janitor returned to his routine, but something had shifted around him. He was no longer unseen. Not because he sought recognition, but because others learned to look. Hospitals continued to buzz. Wars continued to be planned and prevented. A child waited at home each morning for their father to return from night shifts, unaware that the same hands that scrubbed floors had once tipped the balance between life and death. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between titles and uniforms, a truth settled gently: heroism does not announce itself. Sometimes it whispers from the margins, waiting for someone to listen. If this story has touched your heart, if it reminded you that goodness can come from anywhere and anyone, please take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to channel name. Your engagement helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. And before this video ends, leave a comment telling us what part of this story moved you the most. Your words matter more than you know. Because in a world obsessed with power and position, it is often the quiet courage of ordinary people that saves lives, restores faith, and reminds us all what it truly means to serve.